for our last several meetings. Very exciting. So we've got an awesome panel today for you all. Today's meeting was entitled Doing Business with the Government. So we're covering all sides for you. We've got our government side and we've got our supplier side with two great speakers. Our first covering our government side is Amy Suber. Amy has over 15 years experience in the federal government contracting with the Department of Homeland Security, Treasury, the IRS, and is currently a warranted contracting officer with the National Credit Union Administration. Shout out to my agency. Prior to her federal government work, Amy worked in the private and nonprofit sectors, including the American Chemistry Council, LTM Inc., NetStar One, and varying areas such as acquisition, program, and event management. Amy's the primary contracting officer for the National Credit Union Administration for meetings and event contracts, and she's led various agency-wide trainings related to procurement and event management. Her current portfolio covers a broad spectrum of services to include all hotel and meeting event procurements for the NCUA. And from our supplier side, our speaker probably needs very little introduction, Chris McLaughlin, who has 30 years of experience in the hospitality industry and is the Director of Global Government Sales for Sonesta Hotels, an international hotel company comprised of over 1,200 properties and 13 brands. In this role, he drives the revenue strategies for all government lodging programs, plus he oversees the government group market as well as all government contracting. Many of you know Chris as he's been an active member of SGMP since 2000 and earned his Cgmp in 2009. In addition, he served as our NATCAP treasurer from 2013 to 2015 and the national treasurer from 2017 to 2021. Currently, Chris is the second national vice president for the National Board of Directors and is the 2020 recipient of the Sam Gilmer Supplier of the Year Award. Amy and Chris, thank you both so much for joining us today. We have got some great questions that we put together for you and that we had our audience send to us. So we want to get started because we only have this hour and we want to fit them all in. But audience members, if there's anything that you have to ask, feel free to drop it in the chat and we'll try to catch that. If we're not catching it, shout it out and we'll get you answered. But first we're going to get started with Amy. As I mentioned, Amy and I work together, and being a government employee, I have direct contact with my contracting officer, but it occurred to me that we have third-party contract planners in the group and some suppliers who may not know the role of a contracting officer, but believe me, even if you don't work with them directly, they're always in the picture. So Amy, if you can tell us, what is the role of the government contracting officer?
Sure, absolutely. A government contracting officer in layman's terms is someone who has the authority and ability to obligate the government's dollars. So long and short of it, I'm the one who writes the government contracts, and I'm allowed to. I have a warrant from the government that gives me permission to spend the government's money. With that role, what I do is I work with our program offices with a need that they have. So for example, Kim may we may need to hold a meeting for the NCUA. So I work directly with her to develop a request for proposals. We look at different various locations and various companies that could potentially provide these services. We send out an RFP, and that's the request for proposals or solicitation. And I oversee that whole process. The proposals come in directly to a contracting officer. A contracting officer is then the one who instructs the people who evaluate the locations and the different services. They evaluate the proposals. And then I, as the contracting officer, assist with the development of the award. And then I obligate the government's dollars to that award, meaning say that it cost $100,000 for an event. I would have the authority to sign a contract and state, we, the government, can pay $100,000 for this event, right? And then at that point, what the government does, the government contracting officer, is they oversee the entire contract, working in tandem with a core or a technical point of contact, an event planner for the agency who's on site. And we work together to ensure that everything is performed in accordance with the contract. And then we authorize payment to the vendor at the end of it and then close out the contract. So that's sort of just the sort of cradle to grave approach of what the contracting officer does. Does that help?
Absolutely. Thanks for that explanation, Amy.
Mhm.
And you mentioned a few times RFP, and hopefully most people on the line know what an RFP is at this point, our request for proposal. So this question is going to go to both of you. Before we kind of get into trends and what's going on today, let's start at the meat of things because nothing happens without that proposal. So what are some best practices for replying to an RFP? And this is for planners, for our suppliers, planners for writing it, what do we want in there, and suppliers for answering them.
Sure, Chris, if you don't mind, I'll kick this one off and then hand it over to you for another point of view. For the government, we are different than private sector, obviously, right? We have different requirements, we have different restrictions when it comes to soliciting for locations and for events. The most important thing I can tell you is that we structure our RFPs, the government does, and I will tell you, every agency is different. We all have the same fundamental procurement policy as far as competition, things like that, but each agency will have their RFP set up a little bit differently to ensure that they get the information they need to do an evaluation. So with that being said, when you submit your proposals, the best advice I can give you is to follow the instructions. Sometimes they may seem overly tedious and you feel like, hey, I can just send my marketing slick. I can tell you we've got these dates and then we can meet. But unfortunately, that we in the government can't do that when we're going through the procurement process. So what I ask is that I ask because I'm hoping that you're going to be submitting proposals to me, right? But what the government needs you to do is to follow those steps. For example, NCUA, and I can speak to that. We have about 5 specific questions that go out asking about fire safety, safety of the hotel, do you have enough ballrooms to accommodate A? You know, can you do B? These specific questions, honestly, put it in a Word document and answer the questions, right? One of our biggest ones is, do you have, name at least 6 restaurants that you have in the immediate area within 0.75 miles of the hotel? I know that sounds super basic, but we have to accommodate our guests. So if you don't tell us what those restaurants are, we can't do the research for you, right? So those questions, when you ask them, when you answer them, we can then put you into the grouping of hotels or events that we can evaluate. If you don't answer the basic questions, I can't put you into the review because it wouldn't be fair for everyone who did, right? So that's the crux of all of it, is keeping an evaluation fair, right? Because we have to be fair to everyone that submits, which is why everybody has to answer the questions. Another point would be a pricing template. If your government agency asks you to fill out a pricing template, no matter if you think it looks wackadoodle, honestly, fill it out, because they need to take that and compare apples to apples with every proposal that comes in. Highlighting your concessions is a big thing. So when we evaluate, say companies are rated the same, but if there's a company that is maybe even a little bit higher priced, but they have these concessions there, we can use that as a trade-off analysis to award. So my recommendation, and I could talk for hours on this, trust me, is really read that RFP. And fill out the questions and answer them. It doesn't have to be a long dissertation. Just answer the questions. Honestly, that will go a long way. Okay, I'll stop talking.
And Chris, from our supplier side, as you're kind of the one receiving these best practices for replying, what do you pass along to your teams?
Well, that was, first and foremost, excellent content. Nicole Romes, Kim, and Amy, I first want to thank you guys for the opportunity of allowing me to co-present today at the meeting. It's an honor. Years from now, when my grandkids ask me, what were you doing on 2/22 of 2022, I can tell them that I was here with SGMP NATCAP doing this presentation. As far as best practices for replying to an RFP, really everything that's been noted. There are universal practices that go along to responding with any RFPs. Those would be the same for, corporate customers, association members, government members. But as it applies to the government, respond in the manner that the government wants the response. make your venue the obvious choice. One of the things that I did early in my career when I took on representing this vital specialty market segment, I joined SGMP. I obtained my Cgmp certification. Later on, I got my core certification. Not many suppliers really get a core certification because it's not required, but I wanted a better line of sight so I could really understand how government buyers buy. And there are some universal practices that have already been mentioned in today's call. Number one, always meet or beat the deadline. All items that are addressed, again, in the manner that the government wants it, not in the manner that your company has its standard responses set at. Another good practice that I know that I always like to incorporate, make sure that you're addressing all the concessions, terms and concessions, guaranteed cancellation policies, attrition policies, etc. up front. A really big one for me, and it's something near and dear to my heart, especially as it relates to SGMP, is active registration on the system for award management. This information has to be front and center. If it's a mandatory purchasing regulation that the government has to have in order to make that award, make sure that you make it so the government doesn't have to ask for it. Provide that information front and center. Again, this is your company's resume to the government buyer. This is why they should select your hotel. You want to make your property the obvious choice. You don't want anybody to have to necessarily ask for anything. In that same vein, as it applies to responses, also make sure that you're not overdoing it on your proposals, because sometimes you can put so much on a proposal that a lot gets lost in translation. So again, focus on the basics, understand what's being asked, provide that information in the material and the format that the government wants by the deadline. And if you want to illustrate other features that your property may have related to location, related to all the bells and whistles and all of the activities near it, include like a one-page capability statement, and that will really enable the government buyer to then look at that electronic brochure of your property to see what other offerings or what the hotel may look like, how it may profile. And if you're going to send something like that, please don't send a big file. Don't send like a 64 megabyte like PDF or a PowerPoint file. Send it in like a PDF to where it's a one pager and it's easily translatable and readable. So that's what I have.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a question in the chat for Amy. For our hotels who really want to earn the business and stand out during the review process, what would your advice be for them? We're putting you on the spot with that one.
That's okay. That's all right. And just disclaimer, these are just my suggestions. It does not mean you're going to get an award, right? So just that's my contracting officer disclaimer. Christina, there are a few things. If you really want to stand out, and this it's going to sound very basic, filling everything out the way you're supposed to immediately puts evaluators at ease, right? Providing them the information that's been requested puts them at ease. So it's easier for them to evaluate. Standing out above that would be talk about things that are in the area of your hotel, right? Talk about what people can do when they're not at their meeting, right? We don't facilitate big, events for folks to go out and social events, but knowing that there's stuff in the area is really good information to have. Another thing to highlight is highlighting safety of your area. I will tell you, it's in recent years, this has become, started popping up a lot in the development of where should we hold our event. Giving information about how safe it is for folks to be out and about at the hotel, from the hotel property, that's also useful. Trying to think, another thing to highlight would be those concessions. I will tell you, concessions have made and broke different proposals that have come in. For me as a contracting officer, I don't get involved until after the evaluation team has evaluated. But me looking at them, I can almost guarantee I'll know where the award's going to go based on the proposal. And most of those proposals have the concessions in there. Draw attention to them. The government, as you know, we don't have the luxury that a lot of companies in private industry do, right? We have got to keep costs down we basically have to justify that it's okay that we spent the money to go do this event, right? Because for NCUA, it's credit union members' dollars. For DHS or another agency, it's appropriated funds. So we do have to be very cognizant of what we spend. So if you can draw a correlation in your proposal about how it is worth spending the money that it's going to cost, that's great. Talk about per diem, right? A lot of things, it's worth mentioning per diem in your proposal. A lot of times we've done an event where we have to have food, right? Well, as you know, I'm sure you all remember the GSA issue from years and years ago, where they had a conference in Vegas and it was the $35 or $65 croissant, right? Well, we are audited. These expenses are looked at. So when you submit your proposal, keep that in mind, right? We don't get the luxury of going above and beyond of, these fabulous displays and buffets. But if you can draw back to, hey, this is within the per diem rate, we can charge you this, that kind of thing allows us to go back and say, hey, look, executive board, we didn't overspend because everything's tied back to a per diem rate, or while it may seem more than we've paid in the past, look how the costs are within the normal range, right? So these are things, I know that's a long-winded response, Christina, but those things, tying back costs, showing what's in the area, those kinds of things are going to make you stand out.
Thank you. All right, so we've talked about kind of replying to the RFP and given some great tips for our suppliers, but let's talk about the actual contracting and some tips for our planners who are either writing their request for proposals or their solicitation requirements or helping someone with that. Can't get through a meeting without talking about post-pandemic. So how has contracting changed since COVID? Are there new clauses we're writing in? Are there new things that you're considering? Anyone want to jump in on that one first?
Well, we have one of two ways to do this. Amy, if you want to lead, you can, and you're more than welcome to. If you want me to lead, then it would be your way of verifying what I'm actually doing is correct.
Okay, well then let me go ahead and jump in then, because nobody needs to come back.
For the benefit of the audience, now we both had a pretty good awareness of what might be asked today, but Amy and I really did not have the opportunity to prepare together for this.
Right. I'll speak to the government. So how about that? Right. I'll speak to it, and then you can come in. That way, should there be anything that doesn't match up, you get a chance to switch it up. So the pandemic I will give you a little background, and some of you I have worked with in the past, so you're perfectly aware of how it hit the government. We are an agency that has a lot of meetings, and we very quickly had to negotiate with all our hotels to postpone, right? And we're still in the process of trying to get things moving. That being said, what we did was we worked with a couple of the larger hotel chains to come up with, see what they were putting in their contracts, right? What clauses were they putting in their contracts? How could we as the government, because honestly, from our point of view, we have to protect the government dollars, right? We have created our own COVID clauses that go into each one of our agreements. We have standard government terms and conditions, right? But contracting with hotels is different than standard government clauses because there's cancellation fees, right? And sometimes it's a tiered approach. If you cancel your event or postpone your event within 90 days, it's a certain charge, within 45 days, it's a certain charge. So we have tailored our hotel contracts to not only include like the typical hotel cancellation policies and attrition rates, but we have also added a very specific COVID clause. And that COVID clause speaks to what happens if the United States is on a travel ban, due to COVID-19 or some other pandemic reason, or if the agency is on a travel ban. And quite honestly, NCUA is still on a travel ban. And so this has made it's very stressful. We did build into those clauses though, some of our lessons learned, which was we have worked with hotels where they were willing to because we're in a travel ban, postpone our event to like a few of the following year. However, some were able to do that without a monetary effect. Others, and this is what we've built into our clause, if we postpone, we will pay what the cancellation fee is as a deposit on holding the event. Right. So what that means is if I postponed an event that was, say, going to happen tomorrow, or not tomorrow, like in a month or two, if I postponed it, as long as I've rescheduled it with them and I pay the cancellation fee as basically a deposit, when we hold our event in the future, that would come off the total bill. So we do include that type of language. It's hard because we want to. I've been in meeting and events. Okay. Before I came to being a contracting officer, I actually did the meeting and event planning, right? I was on the private side. So we don't want to put hotels in a bad spot. We know this pandemic has hit them. So what we want to do is be sure that we can keep our business with that hotel that won through the competition. We want to be able to keep the money with them, keep that business with them. It benefits both of us. Audra, I see your chat. Yeah, I'm willing to share our clauses. Absolutely. That was just my little spiel of the pandemic and what we've done. If there's something I didn't answer, please let me know.
Chris, if you've got anything to add, otherwise I'm coming to you with the next question.
Well, I do. I have a couple of things to add, actually, and that was an excellent answer, Amy. Thank you for those insights. I'll take this kind of in a multi-layered approach, but it'll be quick. When it comes down to just preparing, what are the expectations? I know on the transient side of things, there are two lodging programs, the FedRIMS program, which is the GSA's program, and DoD preferred. Now, in both lodging programs, in the fall of 2020, this was the COVID year, moving into program selection for 2021, for both FedRIMS and DoD preferred, there were 59 questions that were mandatory questions that had to be answered related to health and safety. A lot of these rotated around COVID-19s and some of the best practices and some of the precautions and so forth that facilities were taking as it related to the pandemic. In fall of 2021, moving into 2022 for that program participation, 47 additional questions related to sustainability and diversity became mandatory program requirements for both FedRIMS as well as DoD preferred. So for anybody who's interested in working with meetings and events and groups and conferences and things like that, I will tell you that the information on the 59 questions related to health and safety, as well as those related to sustainability and diversity, are also relevant as it translates over into the groups and meeting segment. Because really, these are universal standards, whether you're staying with the group or whether you're staying as an individual, will apply to the government traveler. It's good information. GBTA is the organization that launched that. And if you have access to your company's Lanyon platform, which is where all of the transient RFPs are negotiated, you can get a copy of those questionnaires. If you need a copy of the questions that are on those questionnaires, you can go ahead and email me and I'll be happy to provide that to SGMP. As it relates to the contracting component itself, okay, agreeing to the contract. Force majeure and impossibility are two words that have come up very often in my world. And what I can tell you is force majeure and impossibility in today's day and age has become much more of a probability. And I'll say that again, impossibility has become more of a probability. So when you're taking on these agreements, you have to determine the agreements based on risks, and you also have to leverage your relationship and your partnership with complete transparency. So most force majeure clauses that I have seen now encompass public health warnings made by the World Health Organizations, the CDC, and the NIH, and or other emergency or comparable beyond parties, making it impossible, illegal, commercially impractical for either party to perform this obligation under agreement is how it reads. So you definitely want to make sure that you're adhering to whatever the rules are and whatever the government is bound to. And the same would apply to individual travelers, whether it's commercial or any other form of travel. As far as venue selection, I would say that if you are a planner and you're working with a venue, understand that if you're contracting that venue, my recommendation to any planners out there would be strike the iron while it's hot. Because I can tell you right now, the bandwidth issues, the staffing issues, the manpower issues, and the supply chain issues that we're seeing on property level are pretty intense. So if demand comes back, and it's starting to come back now because the government is a major bounce back market, and you can see that people are starting to travel again, that doesn't necessarily mean the venues are prepared and ready for it. That doesn't even mean they're staffed for it. I know there are 500 room hotels right now that are open. You know, they maybe have 150 to 200 rooms open max. So they're operating in limited capacities because across this nation, we've got serious supply chain and manpower issues when it comes down to the hospitality industry, specifically at full service hotels. So if you're a contract planner, a contracting, anybody in contracting or anybody searching for a venue, and you get a quality venue that's offering those concessions, my recommendation to you would be make sure that you're basically applying some kind of force majeure policy to your contract. And I would definitely take that opportunity while it was available, because right now, as I'm responding to groups in my system right now, there's not a lot left for 2022. And that's based on just supply and demand. So I would say if you get a quality venue, make sure that you confirm it, and you confirm it quickly. Because I know that, there are other things that you can incorporate, to protect interested parties, like rebook clauses, or, maybe as it relates to guarantee cancellation and attrition, you could always like set up a clause to where you credit the group for replacement business based on an inventory pickup the hotel provides in case they sell rooms that you didn't pick up after the fact. That's to protect all interested parties, to make sure that you're doing everything that you can to work with the hotel and work with the customer to maintain a level of flexibility to where if those rooms sell, you're not necessarily, trying to enforce an attrition clause that might not be relevant because you ran 90%. But other than that, those would be my primary ideas behind that. I'm not sure if those are the right ones or if that's what the group was looking for, but that's kind of where I would go there.
Chris, you talked about some, and Amy talked about some as well. Anything else to add about kind of from the hotel side, renegotiating contracts that need to be canceled or postponed? Any tips for planners who are assisting with that?
This is kind of my plug to SGMP. Then I guess I would just say that, just make sure that you're going into these partnerships with a level of flexibility and a level of awareness. Every organization is going to have a different deal. Lucky for us, a lot of the relationships that I have are relationships with SGMP. So there's a lot of partnership transparency, and that's why belonging to professional associations like SGMP and becoming active and really maintaining those relationships is so important in today's climate, because there can be a level of honesty and transparency that you work with. I know a business owner, this is not an apples to apples scenario, but I knew a business owner who was sidelined because, he didn't have customers going into a store. He had a lease agreement that he had to pay. That landlord had one of two options. He could either reduce the monthly lease fee and defer that payment to a later time, or he could stick the guy with the whole thing and he could break him. Option two wouldn't have really worked out in the long term for all interested parties. Option one did. So I would just say that whatever solution you can work out together, leverage those relationships and make sure that you're just approaching things with a level of patience and flexibility.
Anything else to add, Amy, before we?
Of course, right? I do. And Chris, those were really good points. And I would just, I'd like to echo a little more of what Chris said about creating partnerships. So the balance is difficult for a contracting officer as well as someone, the event planner for the agency, right? Because they have to be impartial. However, building relationships does not guarantee you an award, but it does guarantee you a solid, open communication relationship. That's the best advice I can give you. We have a particular hotel chain that had received a couple awards from us in 2019 and 2020. They worked with us, right? I did not have, as a contracting officer, as soon as that pandemic hit, I had a sense of dread that I had to go negotiate 30 contracts. and how we were going to make this happen. But when you have relationships built, that honesty is there, right? I mean, you still have your role as the government, you have your role as the meeting planner, you have your role as the hotel, but being able to talk and say, look, we want to keep the meeting with you. We don't want to take it away from you all. We want you to have the revenue. Help us make this happen for you, right? So if you can have that kind of relationship, you're still going to follow the guidelines of government negotiation and government contracting, but you have that rapport and you're willing to work with each other. And that went a long way for NCUA during the pandemic.
Thanks. All right, I've got a question that came to me from an audience member, and it's for you, Amy, but I may take the first part of the answer because I work with you on this part of it. But the question is, what are your thoughts about what are your thoughts about the planner having some knowledge of the venues and the proposals received in terms of meeting the requirements, as opposed to just looking at the cost outlined and seeing that? The way we work, Amy and I, is I actually do see all of the proposals and evaluate the venues before I see any costs. So my decision is made as to who I want to go to before costs are even in the picture. So I'm not saying, oh, these guys are the cheapest, let's pick them, or they're the most expensive, they're fancy, let's pick them. I'm evaluating my hotels completely before any costs are even in the picture. Amy, anything else to add with that and in your past?
That's exactly right. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something important for everyone to know in government procurement in general. No matter what, whether it's hotels, you're buying IT services, you're buying contracted services, staff augmentation. The evaluation team never sees the cost. They never see it through their evaluation. It is only once they've completed their evaluation and submitted their consensus to the contracting officer that cost comes into play, right? So and the reason for that is to keep impartiality, right? Because you can't help it. If you're going into Target and you're buying, something, a bike at Target, if you see one on sale that's $50, that all of a sudden becomes the really great bike when the $250 bike just doesn't seem in reach anymore. But so you start to not look at those other things. That's why cost doesn't come into play until after the consensus is reached. The other thing to consider, the government does not always go with the lowest price. When you see that RFP, if the RFP states that this is a best value, right, a best value trade-off decision, that means the government will take everything that's submitted and make a determination what the most highly technical rated proposal is, as well as the cost implications. And then I do a trade-off. So you know what, this hotel is more expensive. However, we get this concession, this concession, this concession. The safety is higher. They were stronger when it comes to having bigger rooms that worked for us. Their AV proposal offered us, other things that other companies did not. Then I do a trade-off and say, you know what, the government is willing to pay this much more money for this because we get all of this, right? So that's something that's why when we talked earlier, we were talking about show your concessions. Tell us what you can do in the hotel rooms. Tell us what you can do with AV, really sell yourself, because that goes into a trade-off. I will tell you, I won't know going in who Kim's going to come back to me with. And I won't be able to say, hey, Kim, by the way, you really need to check out, Hotel A, because they're like $30,000. It's going to be nothing for us. Do it. I can't do that. I can't talk to her about it. Even if she says, I'm looking at this, I can listen to her, but I can't give her any information. So keep that in mind. So Kim, that was a really good answer.
And I do want to jump in and say it is vastly different for contract planners, where price is absolutely a consideration.
Thanks for that. Is that you, Nicole? That sounds like
it is. It's me.
What did you say? I didn't catch it. What did you say?
It's vastly different for contract planners, where price is absolutely a consideration for us.
Yeah, it's definitely a consideration for the government agency, but it's not the deciding factor unless you see something in that RFP that says we are going with the lowest price technically acceptable. If you see that in there, it is 100% on cost.
Mm-hmm.
As long as you meet the requirements, it's 100% on cost. it is important to note that even though I did explain that, there is the trade-off, cost is important to the government. So do take it into consideration. Don't just say, all right, free for all. No, you do have to take costs into consideration, but it is not the final deciding factor.
And it can be the final factor sometimes for those of us working on a contract.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, thanks for that question, Melody. All right, Chris, this one is for you. What trends are you seeing with government business since the start of the pandemic? So in regards to space or food, things like that, what are you seeing? And are those changing now that we're hopefully kind of coming out of the heavy COVID period?
All right, this is my turn. I'll have to condense
a loaded question.
Yeah, I'm sure that, the other hotel NSOs like Christina, Max, and Jill, they're rolling their eyes. They're like, don't ever ask this guy an open-ended question, please. But in all seriousness, I think that some of the trends that I'm seeing, are optimistic at this stage. People are starting to go back to work. I know it was a big blow to me. There's another professional organization out there related to the government market. It's the National Defense Transportation Association. And their annual conference happens every year at the end of February, beginning of March at the Hilton Mark Center in Alexandria, Virginia. And they decided, due to Omicron, at the beginning of the year, they were going to cancel NDTA. And that was a big blow to me, because it's a conference that's an incredible conference. It's everything that's government transient under the sun. All the government lodging programs and the TMCs and everybody that support that go to that. So knowing that conference was happening at the end of February, beginning of March, almost kind of set the pace to where I thought first quarter was going. Recently in the news, we've seen a lot more positive news as it relates to the pandemic. So I think right now, again, people are starting to go back to work. Inventory is starting to open. Generally speaking, as it relates to government travel in general, and this is both transient and group, we're seeing an upswing. I think the government market collectively has been a bounce back market in the industry. I think through 2022 into 2023, it will continue to be a bounce back segment and a vital bounce back segment in the industry. And that's why I think it's important that suppliers invest in this segment to a very high degree. I also think that because a lot of the government employees, federal employees, contractors that work with the government, because they've been fully vaccinated, and most of them had been fully vaccinated back in November, and because they've got so many training programs that have been backlogged, and they've got so much to do, that I just anticipate that this is just going to be, again, a very steady segment to invest in if you are a supplier. So looking at it from a supplier advantage, these are the things that we're seeing. We're seeing a lift in official DoD travel. We're seeing a lift in official GSA travel, and I'm getting more requests for groups and conferences every week. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's good to hear. We're all happy, I think, to get back on the road and traveling and holding our events in person. Along that same vein, Chris, do you have any recommendations for our planners to talk to their hosts or to talk to their contracting officers about the realities of cost right now, just due to inflation and supply chain issues?
Is that question for me or Amy?
Yeah, we'll start with you on that one. Just what's going on in the hotel industry with cost?
With cost, there are a lot of things going on right now, even from a global vantage unrelated to the pandemic, that may ultimately drive cost. So my biggest recommendation that I would have to anybody, whether they're a supplier or a supplier, and I know this is going to sound like a perpetual commercial for SGMP, but invest in SGMP, join SGMP, get to know the people there, get to know the professionals there, and don't be afraid to reach out to them. I can honestly tell you that the return on investment that I've received over the years through SGMP, I have not attended, SGMP is not the type of society where you will attend a trade show and you'll get 15 leads and convert 3 of them. It can be that organization for you. That's not where the real return on investment is with the society. The real return on investment in the society is the education and the contacts that you meet, because there's a lot of intellectual capital here. Some of the people that I talk to often, Christina, Christine, who's on the SGMP National Board, I talk to her, almost daily. Nicole Rome's the president of NATCAP. I talk to her all the time. if you have an idea or you have a question, don't be afraid to reach out to people to understand, to gain a better understanding of what's going on. Because I know Christine, for instance, or Nicole, for instance, know there are times where they have to talk to me like I'm 4 years old, and I'm okay with that. The thing is that the resources here internally within SGMP, and that's why being a part of this society has meant so much to me in my career over the time I've been in it. I can really tell you that I would have not been able to successfully navigate through this pandemic had it not been for the professionals that I leaned on and talked to and kept in contact with that were all members of SGMP.
Great. I've got a couple things just kind of related to the same topic in the chat. Make sure I'm not missing any of them. Sorry. The first is, can the government renegotiate a contract if food and beverage pricing has gone through the roof? So I'm assuming this is, say we've postponed, I know I've got an event that I've postponed since 2020. So if food and beverage has changed, can we renegotiate those costs? Either of you want to chime in on that?
I can tell you from the government point of view, if it's a contract that has been postponed and the date's been moved, I would have no problem if the vendor reached out to me and said, we need to talk about the prices, here's why. And then we could potentially enter into some negotiations. So it really depends on the contract, right? Are you talking about if we had meals planned or something like that, which is a lot different than if we just had drinks sitting out and beverages and like a brownie, right? So I think the important thing is the answer would be yes, the government could potentially renegotiate. It would just depend. My recommendation is to reach out to the government and just let them know why you want to have that conversation and just give them a little bit of background. I mean, we all know that prices have gone up. We go to the grocery store. So the goal would not be for the government to tie you down to that price if it was 2 years ago, right? That's different. But I would say that the government isn't all of a sudden going to double what they were paying you. That's my guess. And it really depends on the contract. That being said, if this is a contract that was just awarded, I'm not sure. It would really depend on that government agency and the contracting officer and the contract if it could be renegotiated. I would tell you if I awarded something in the last 2 months and then the hotel came and said, we need to renegotiate because our prices have gone up. I would listen, but I can't say that I would be willing to negotiate. It was very recent, right? So those kinds of things would have to be taken into consideration when you proposed. So it's kind of a slippery slope. I think that's kind of important why you need to keep your lines of communication open with your contract partner.
I don't have anything to add. That's a phenomenal answer. Thank you.
Another question, there's two that are kind of similar. Chris, are there any direct impact supply chain issues with hotels right now that you could elaborate on? And this is to include part 2 of the question, challenges with hotel service providers, with room service, with cleaning and things like that. Are you still seeing any of those types of issues?
I think the industry as a whole is, and I think that most of the suppliers who represent, national hotel companies and international hotel companies that I've spoken with would agree, is that right now I would call the situation fluid. So if we're not immune to the same things that you're seeing, again, at the grocery store or what you're seeing on the news, is that, getting things are not as easy as is what they once were. In several situations really related to supplies, it's almost like a feast or famine type of situation for hotels. The biggest issue that we've had would be a manpower issue. And I know hotels that's the thing, is when it comes down to staffing and manpower, I know that's where most of the hotels that I've been exposed to, that I represent, that's where they've seen the biggest hit. But again, to the other point I made earlier on the call, right now things are, the needle is starting to move there, so things are starting to turn to a much more optimistic climate. I know people are starting to go back to work, and I know a lot of people are ready to get back to work. So, again, this could all change a month from now, depending on what happens. So I know that it's, things are still a little crystal ballish out there. That's what I would say about that. But right now, if I were a betting man, I would bet that the industry is well on its way to a recovery now. And this is just my own personal opinion. I'm not basing this on scientific facts. This is just the Chris McLaughlin hunch. But it would appear as though things are starting to trend back to a higher sense of what we once knew as normal. Is that we are starting to see more reservations for more government travelers on site through organizations like travel management companies, CWT, Sato Travel, Omega World Travel, Duluth Travel. We're starting to see an upswing in the government lodging programs, DoD preferred and fed rooms, standard GOB bookings, and the requests that we're getting from some of our contract planners, opportunities that we're now seeing on public domain, opportunities that we're getting from travel management companies and third parties and just planners direct. Those are all starting to incrementally increase. So all of the signs would appear as though they're moving in positive directions. As it relates to supply chain, that seems to be moving in positive directions, but things are getting more expensive.
Unfortunately. All right, we've got a few more minutes to go before we want everyone to jump over to the SGMP Strong Call, but let's wrap up with our final question, and maybe our most difficult question. Chris, from the supplier side, what do you find most challenging in doing business with the government?
This is going to sound like it's not an answer, but it is an answer. I don't find it difficult. I don't find anything difficult about working with the government, and I'll tell you why. To Amy's point, if you've done your homework, there should be no surprises. The government is, again, the reason that when I joined SGMP and I obtained my Cgmp certification, I was a lot younger than I was today, and I was thirsting for a lot of knowledge. And when Garland Preddy, who's the education director, taught the contracting component of that, she said, okay, this is the most boring, awful part of the whole education process, and nobody likes this. And I loved it. So right after that, I contacted a gentleman by the name of Robert Kaufman. And I said, Rob, where can I go to learn, to find more information about this? He recommended management concepts and going through core certifications. So I got my core certification back, I want to say it was probably around 2011. And it was one of the better things that I did because the expectations are always clearly illustrated to me. So if I'm reviewing a statement of work, if I'm reviewing a request for proposal from the government, if you go through that, there really should be no surprises. If you belong to an organization like SGMP and you work with the professionals that you do on a daily and weekly basis, there should be no surprises. I mean, everything is predictable. Everything is transparent. So because there is a high level of predictability, because there are ethics involved, because there's a high level of transparency, it's really what it really boils down to for me is explaining to that director of sales at property level or owner operator, there is going to be a level of risk involved. Here are the variables that we have in front of us. These are the monies that the government has to spend. These are the maximum allowances where they can spend them. This is how you have to reply to the RFP. And this is what they need in the terms and conditions. This is absolute. You're not going to run this by the attorney, and you're not going to have your attorney augment clauses that have already been laid out and presented by the government. Because here's how the government's going to do it. You're either going to take it on their terms, or they're going to find another supplier who will take it on their terms. And that is our job as hotel representatives and stewards of this industry in this segment to explain to our property level personnel that this is the way the government buys. So you cannot expect the government to adapt to your sales pitch. You must adapt your sales pitch to the government procurement process. And that is how you win in this segment. And that is why there are no challenges.
Thank you. And Amy, I know we are the government side, so of course it's great working with us, but
Right,
since
we're
you have
awesome,
been on the
right?
private side as well, coming from the other side and now being government, can you tell us what you think are some of the challenges?
And I'm gonna talk to being on the other side of it for just a second. I know that sounds odd. But first, Chris, great point on the terms. Just so everybody knows, the government, when you do submit your RFP, we are not trying to be difficult about our terms and conditions. We are not trying to stick it to somebody or anything like that. We have to go with our terms and conditions. We can sometimes incorporate something from the hotel if there's a big conflict, but really that's the way government contracting is. So great point. I absolutely forgot to mention that earlier. But from being on the private sector, it does feel like a lot of work working with the government, right? And I'm aware of it because I was on the other side. It takes a long time unless you have a really speedy contracting officer. That's all. It takes a long time to go through the review process and evaluation and award because it goes through all kinds of government reviews. It feels like you are jumping through hoops because you can't just get your marketing slick, get the dates available and punch it into a system and send them out, a quick little proposal. There are other steps that have to be done. And then you've got the money constraints, right? We're the government. So that is difficult. And I do feel your pain on that side of it, right? Proposing, especially when the government comes back and says, you just proposed $50 per person per break. Any way you can bring it down to 20, right? I mean, I know some of these requests seem over the top. So we do know that there's difficulty working with the government, especially with the holding the dates, right? We try to move ours at our agency through very quickly, but a lot of agencies don't have the flexibilities we have, and it could take months to award, whereas NCUA, typically it's about a 45-day turnaround for us, depending on the size of the event. But I just wanted to point that out. We do feel your pain from the government side. The best advice I can offer you would be to ask questions when that solicitation comes out. Don't just throw something over the fence because that's not going to help you. If you have questions, get them all down, shoot them over to the contracting officer. We'll get you answers. And then it gives you a better chance of submitting a proposal that's going to be considered and have a good chance of winning. As far as difficulties on the government side, I have to say the only difficulty that I have faced in the last 5 years or so is the not following the RFP instructions. And I know that sounds really basic, but if you follow those instructions, it makes everything so much easier. It really does. Ask those questions. If you want to, another suggestion I have, I don't know if other agencies will do it, but we will. If you want to meet with the agency just to tell them about your hotel brand or your visitors bureau, or that you're a meeting planner, we're not going to send, if you're a third-party meeting planner, I don't have the authority to send you work, right? That's a conflict of interest. But if you want to meet to learn about the NCUA, to learn about how we do our government contracts, when we typically have meetings, reach out. Absolutely. That kind of connection will help down the line. It doesn't mean that an award is going to be directed at you, but it can help keep you in the vendor list, right? We may meet and say, oh, hey, we were going to meet in Louisville. I remember what hotel came and met with us. They really asked a lot of questions. They seem to have a location that might work for us. This helps keep you in vendor pools. So don't hesitate to reach out. I would build your networks. That's my biggest recommendation.
Absolutely, I agree with that. The second part was kind of overcoming challenges, and I would just say relationship building from both sides, and just being a part of SGMP definitely helps with that. But attending events, suppliers coming in, meeting planners, I know, and that really helps you understand what they're looking for. And I definitely think that's the way to overcome those challenges. We are at the end. Thank you both so much. I think this was awesome. I don't see any questions in the group. You've got like 2 minutes to throw it in there really quick if you've got any last questions. But otherwise, Amy, Chris, we really, really appreciate your input. And I'm sure we'll be reaching back out to you for Education Day in the fall with brand new topics, as hopefully we'll all be back on the road then, and meetings will be all a go once again. Thank you all for joining us. I will kick it back to Nicole for any final words.
Thank you so much, Kim, Chris, and Amy. You guys were amazing. I loved every minute of it. So much great information. I just have one request from our audience. If you are logged into your Zoom account with a name other than what you registered with, please send me an email and let me know, president@sgmpnatcap.org. That way I can make sure you get credit for attending the session. And I'm looking so forward to seeing everyone in person next month. We will be hybrid, so don't worry if you're not in the area. You'll still get to watch and listen along, but I'm looking forward to seeing everyone. And I'm dropping the SGMP Strong link in the chat right now. But thank you so much. Head on over there for networking, and we'll see you all there.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.